House Bill 2486, and I'll ask Revisor Mike Heim to give a overview of the bill.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this bill deals with poll books, electronic poll books, and it amends a article in the current law dealing with electronic and electromechanical voting systems. So if you read the title to the bill, you've got a pretty good summary. I won't stop there, though. I'll run through each section, but whoever wrote that title, which wasn't me, included about everything under the kitchen sink, and it's a good title. I'm not saying it's not. Anyway, Section 1 is a definition section for this article dealing with electronic and electromechanical voting systems, and it adds on page 2 a definition of electronic poll book, which means electronic list of registered voters for a particular precinct or polling location that may be transported to a polling location and on which each voter may sign the voter signature. It includes both the hardware and software. It's a type, an electronic poll book is a type of poll book as required in different statutes. Electronic poll book equipment, including direct recording systems that are components of the, basically does not include the automatic tabulating equipment, data processing, and so on. Section 2 deals with the Board of County Commissioners, and they're authorized to purchase electronic poll book. Section 3, the Board of County Commissioners and the election officer may provide an electronic or voting system or electronic poll book. It provides that they can issue bonds, that's current law for this type of equipment, to purchase them. It gives in subsection C on page 2 the ability of the Board of County Commissioners and County Election Officer to adopt, experiment with, or abandon any electronic, electromechanic or poll book system. Subsection D, it provides that they, after a certain date, they may purchase, rent, or lease as defined on and after the effective date. They cannot, unless the system provides a paper record that's current law, has the ability to be tested and so on. And a new subsection E, no component of an electronic or electromagnetic voting system shall have the capacity to be connected to the internet or any other communication or computer network, including but not limited to a local area network, wireless network, Bluetooth, and so forth. After July 1 of this year, no Board of County Commissioners or county election officer can purchase or lease any electronic poll book unless the kind and make has been certified by the Secretary of State. So that gives the Secretary of State responsibility for certification. The Section 4 on page 3, the Secretary of State shall examine and approve the kinds and makes of electronic and electromechanical voting systems, including electronic poll books. So that adds that to that section. Section 5 deals with basically vendors and how they go about getting the Secretary of State to review their equipment. Section 6 on page 4 deals with the electronic and electromagnetic systems that are approved and has different requirements. If you look in subsection N on page 5, again, you have that restriction shall not have the capability nor any component of an electronic or electromechanical system have the capability to be connected to the internet. Anyway, there's a provision about storage and how the storage on section 8 has to be secure and so on. Section 9 deals with ballot information and so forth. Subsection C is new before, and during, and after the operation of the polling place. The election judge shall ensure that no component of the electronic or electromechanical voting system is connected to the internet. There's a requirement in Section 10, current law dealing with the testing of equipment prior to the elections. Section 11 amends the crime of electronic or electromechanic voting system or electronic poll book fraud, so it adds poll book to the crime of fraud. Anyway, if you, the Section 12 requires Secretary of State to adopt rules and regulations, including the use of electronic poll books. And anyway, Section 13, the optical scanning equipment may be located in a place. There is a provision in dealing with that, that the scanning equipment on page 8 shall not have the capability nor shall any component of it be connected to the internet. So anyway, it's basically it's amending current law dealing with these electronic and electromechanical voting systems to plug in poll books and scanning equipment and to ensure that they're not connected to the internet.
Any questions for Mr. Heim about the basics of the bill before we go on to testimony? Anyone online? Excuse me? Oh, okay. Representative Dodson.
One quick question, please. When we're talking about the requirements for the voting systems, are these the same or different than those required by federal statute?
You can ask the Secretary of State that question. I'll let them answer that.
Thank you.
Representative of the Secretary of State.
Not seeing any hands on the screen. Any other questions? Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee. Revisor Heim did a great job of going through the details of this, so I'm not gonna dive in nearly as much depth. I'm just gonna kind of hit the wave top so that everybody understands basically what this bill does. At the core of our democracy, and you've heard me say it before, at the core of our democracy is that people have confidence that the results of the election reflect the will of the people. And as you've heard people talk about the 2020 election, the concerns that are frequently raised are around voting and tabulation machines and around numbers being manipulated by the internet. So I feel like it's a responsibility of this body and of the larger body of the legislature to do everything we can to ensure confidence in our elections. And that's why when the Secretary of State asked me to sponsor this bill, I was happy to do that. The first thing that this bill does is make it illegal to buy or use voting machines that are connected to the internet. Now that's already something that the state is doing and that county clerks are doing. They're not getting machines that connect to the internet, but there's no law right now that says it should be illegal or says that it's illegal. And so this places in the statute the requirement that voting machines not be connected to the internet and we not get any that could possibly be connected to the internet. And the other thing that this does in that regard is it requires election judges at the polling places to verify that that's, to certify that that's the case, that the machines that are approved by the Secretary of State that don't connect to the internet are what are being used at the polling place. Just one more layer of assurance to the public that their vote's going to get counted and that no votes that aren't cast are going to get counted. The next thing that this bill does is regulate electronic poll books. Electronic poll books are the list of voters in that precinct that are allowed to vote in that precinct, that are registered to vote. These have to be connected to the internet or connected in some way, networked in some way to the other polling places, because this is the mechanism by which we assure that a person doesn't go to one polling place and vote and then go to another polling place and vote again. So they have to be connected. And these electronic polling books or poll books are already in use, but they're not currently regulated in statute in any way, or even frankly allowed in statute. We're just doing it. And so what this does is give the Secretary of State's office the authority to regulate these and determine which ones are safe for use in Kansas elections. The final thing that this bill does very quickly is there has to be a certification of the voting machines before and after the vote. But right now in statute, it doesn't say when after the vote. It doesn't set a specific deadline. And so what this does is it sets a deadline of 5 days after the county canvassers have voted to certify the election, because there's a statutory deadline to contest the election, and it makes sure that that machine verification process happens before that deadline expires, so that if there is something wrong, the candidates involved would have the ability to contest the election. Currently in statute, they could wait any amount of time, and it could be past the deadline for the, it could theoretically be past the deadline to certify, to contest the election when we find out that there was some problem with the voting or tabulation machines. So with the last thing I'll say before I stand for questions is we heard a great bill last year from one of our colleagues on making it illegal to connect voting machines to the internet. This is very similar. I think that this specifies Bluetooth where the previous bill didn't, but other than that, the language is very similar. So we've heard that portion of this before in part. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
I believe we have opportunity for questions. If anyone has any questions for Representative Proctor. Thank you. Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Proctor. I find myself in the very uncomfortable position of agreeing with almost everything you said.
Make a habit of it.
When's the last time in Kansas you ever heard of somebody voting in one place and then going to another and voting a second time?
I don't have that information.
Oh, I do. It never happens, okay? And the reason I bring that up is because every time we say something or infer that something like that is going on, it undermines the confidence in the system that you're trying to instill. So I'm going to make a bold, factual statement and stand for correction from anybody in the world. People do not vote on the same election in two different precincts. One, they will get caught doing it, and two, it would be the lead story on America's Dumbest Criminals. Because if you think that one vote is so important to risk felony conviction, you're pretty stupid. And you won't get away with it either. So again, I only make these remarks because I, like you, firmly believe that it is important. It's fundamental that the public have confidence in our elections. And right now there is so much BS going around that undermines it. I like to take the opportunity to put an end to it whenever I can. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, if I could just say one thing about it.
Yes,
so I apologize if I implied that does occur. What I was trying to communicate is that the electronic poll book is the way we stop it from occurring. And it's a check on that. But the other thing I would say is I believe that a previous Secretary of State, or maybe this Secretary of State, has found incidences of people voting in more than one state. And they've been prosecuted for that.
That is true, but it had nothing to do with going to one precinct and then another. It had to do with the ability to cast a vote remotely. And also, I really never missed the opportunity to brag up that Secretary of State for having the courage to prosecute all 11 Republicans that he caught doing that.
Thank you for that extra comment, or that final comment. And any other questions for Representative Proctor? Okay. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, Representative Osman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I wanted to know, so on multiple occasions on here, it does say, will not have the capability for any internet access, any network, any connection to anything whatsoever. Is there a requirement that there's a paper backup to all of these polling locations? And if not, what is the method by which information is taken from these machines to transfer to another place?
So I'm going to, if I can, defer to the Secretary of State's office when they give their testimony, because I'm not nearly as familiar with the technical details of that than they are. But I'm relatively sure that there's a paper backup. I'm pretty sure that point, but I'll defer to the Secretary of State's office.
Representative Lee?
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your testimony, Pat. So, quick question for you, and you may not know this. It may be something for the Secretary's office. I'm curious to know, are we going to put, and I'm sorry, I have not gone through this bill yet, admittedly. Are we going to put anywhere that they all need to use the same Wi-Fi for these poll books? Or how do we secure these poll books that are going online, that it's the same, like that we're not using some sort of Amazon-based server, or that different counties are using different, because those can be hacked into also. So are we going to all use the same throughout the state, or how does that work?
So the Secretary of State, when he was here last meeting testifying, talked about this at length. They've got an internal system that they use to communicate between poll books. I'll defer to them to the specific technical details of it, but they do have their kind of proprietary system that they use in order to communicate between the poll books. And so I'm well out of my depth on the IT of that, so I'm going to leave it to them to answer that question for you, if that's okay.
Sure. So that is not, those specified in here, anything about the Wi-Fi in terms of specific XYZ Wi-Fi should be used uniformly throughout the state?
No, it directs the Secretary of State to set those standards and enforce those standards, but it doesn't direct which standards he has to adopt. That's correct.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Representative Proctor. And
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
now we'll move on to Clay Barker, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and General Counsel for the Secretary of State's office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Revisor Heim and Representative Proctor. I'm going to repeat some of what the representative said, just to make sure it's all clear. Feel free to ask me questions. We also have the county election officer from Harvey County, so if you have specific questions about how counties implement this, he may know a little, well, he does know more than I do. First of all, the Secretary of State is sponsoring 3 bills this year. This one is on the security of election equipment. We're going to hear another one about voter roll maintenance today, and then tomorrow morning in House, Fed, and State, there's a third one on audits. So that's our 3. Of the 3, this is the most important one for our office, specifically the part about certifying electronic poll books. So let me put this into context. There's 2 chapters in the Kansas Election Code, 44 that has to do with electronic voting equipment and tabulators, and Chapter 46, which is optical scanners and tabulators. And if you've ever read the whole code like I have, they duplicate somewhat because they both cover tabulators. The reason we want to certify the electronic poll books is because right now they are uncertified. Counties can buy anything they want. Why counties want electronic poll books is 2 reasons generally. One, they speed up the process substantially of voters checking in, because you swipe your driver's license and it brings up the record. The really high-speed ones can actually bring up a picture of the voter, and you can verify it's the right person. And the second, instead of going through a paper poll book and trying to find the right name, and there's compound last names and things like that. And the second reason is it reduces errors where 2 people have the same name, maybe a junior and a senior at the same address, and you accidentally give voting credit to the wrong one. And they're becoming more and more popular. The reason they need to be connected to the internet is, like Representative Proctor said, is 2. When you do advanced voting, especially in the larger counties like Johnson or Sedgwick or Shawnee, you may have multiple advanced voting locations, and any voter can go to any one of those. So if you go to one and vote, it takes you off the list for all of them. And again, I've never heard of anyone voting twice. I've heard lots of rumors of it, but there's never any substance. The other is vote centers, which was a law passed by the legislature 2 or 4 years ago, which gives counties the option of, instead of having polling places where voters are assigned to it from their precinct, the county can just set up a network of voting places and you can go to any one. And that's another reason why the poll books need to talk to each other. So if you vote at one, you come off. Inside the polling place, especially a large one that may have multiple electronic poll books to check in, they all need to talk to each other. So if you check in at one station, that you come off all of them, although those could be wired instead of over the internet. These standards we want to use for the certification are being issued by the Federal Election Assistance Commission. Now, they issue standards for electronic voting equipment, and that is the basis for our state certification of the voting machines right now. If you pass the EAC standards, we inspect the machine, we talk to the vendor. Actually, a system's being certified today for Harvey County in our office. And once you've passed all that, then we certify the equipment, and any county can buy any piece of equipment on the certified list. So this is just adding poll books to that process, which is why if you look through the bill, everywhere it says electronic voting equipment, it now says and poll books, or and electronic poll books. We're adding it into the same process. The second provision of this bill is the no internet. Now, since 2006, it has been the state's policy, and all counties have agreed to follow it, that no election equipment or tabulators that count ballots can be connected to the internet, and that's to prevent them from being hacked. What people have pointed out, that's a policy, it's not a law. What would prevent some rogue county administrator from deciding they're going to connect their machines to the internet, even though we've gotten certificates from every county that they won't use them, and every vendor has given us certificates that their machines are not capable of being hooked up to the internet. This just places it in law. And it may be a little overkill. Representative Topliker has asked me about this, but it says counties cannot buy equipment that's connected to the internet. They cannot own equipment that has the capability of being connected to the internet. And the election judges at the polling place are supposed to check to make sure the machines are not connected to the internet. And the question was, how is an election judge supposed to know that? They're not an electrical engineer. Our vision was it would just be another item on the checklist. They look around for anything odd in the office, same that they do disability access and the other parts of the poll or the polling place analysis. And if the body thinks that language we have is a little too strong and wants to change it, that's perfectly acceptable. The idea was it's just one more thing for the judge to look for, even though we know the machines don't have the capability of being hooked up to the internet. And the third part of the bill is, as long as we were changing the machines and the optical scanners, it's a public meeting, although no one ever shows up to it, that the election machines before the election have a test deck run through them, through the tabulators. So the election officers know what the results should be, and it's run through, and we make sure the results come out correctly, and bad ballots are kicked out. It's a test for the machine. And then it said after the canvass, that's supposed to be done again, but as Representative Proctor pointed out, there was no deadline for that. We picked 5 days so it aligns with the 5 days for an election contest. Now, some people have asked, why don't you do that before the canvass so people will know if the machines work? That's because you can't touch the machine until after the canvass is done. The canvass, the Board of County Canvassers may want to look at the machine. You can't say, well, we run something else through it, we've reprogrammed it. It has to stay pristine until the canvass is done. That's why the test is done after the canvass, not before. So again, just in quick summary, it's 3 things with election equipment: the certification of poll books to give that authority to the Secretary of State, so only certified poll books can be purchased by counties, purchased and used. No internet connection, which again is kind of redundant, but it puts it in law, and specifying 5 days for the post-election test of the machines. So before and after they're tested, and the public can come look at it if they want. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll stand for any questions.
Pretty much a simple question, but does a power outage, area power outage in a thunderstorm, could that affect this type of equipment, the operation of it?
We have not seen the final EAC standards, but one of them is battery backup for the poll books.
Representative Topiker?
You mentioned that we've had some sort of law against or on poll books, electronic poll books since 2006, I think you said, or?
2006 was a policy about voting machines, whether it's a ballot marking device or tabulator. There's nothing about electronic poll books. Now, a poll book is defined as a book in which the voter must sign their name in order to get a ballot. So the paper ones have been around since 1861.
So I've worked in elections before at the polling place, and this was back before electronic poll books. So what did we do back then to ensure that someone couldn't vote at two places? How did one precinct location communicate with another one to ensure that a voter didn't vote two or three different places? How did that work back then?
Mr. Pifo might be able to give a little more detail, but each polling place had a poll book of only the voters that were assigned to that polling place. So if you're in precinct 1-1, you were only on one polling place's poll book. If you went to the wrong polling place, they'd say, you're not on our poll book, so we can't sign you in and give you a ballot. That's how they did it with the paper in the past.
Okay. And I just wondered about that. So the provision in the bill about the election judges, it says judges. How many judges do we have at a polling place?
One judge per polling place who runs it.
Okay, so we're talking about the whole area when we say in the bill the judges. Okay, so they're not trained. Are you going to provide a manual of some sort to tell them policy somehow, to show them, are they going to be going around the baseboards of the room looking for wires here and there and connections to the poll books, or what's the deal on that? How are they going to ensure that nothing is connected to the internet?
I've spoken with our Director of Elections, Brian Caskey, who told me, in our office does a lot of guidance to counties. Counties don't work for us, but we obviously work very closely together with them, that we would come up with a list of things that a judge can check, like a checklist. And again, I realize it might be overkill to have the judge also verify that the machines that by law can't be connected to the internet aren't, but it's just one more step to look around.
And isn't it a big weight to put on the judge's shoulders to say that nothing is connected? I mean, when they might not really know. There might be some sort of and this is all theoretical, Mr. Chairman. I'm just, future stuff. What if in the future you could do a wireless connection? They can't see it. And so this law would be making them in violation of the law if they sign off and say nothing here is connected. Well, they're responsible for that certification or verification, according to this bill, that nothing is connected. And so shouldn't we have the Secretary of State be the one that's responsible ultimately to ensure that there's no connection?
Representative, we'd be happy to put out guidance or standards. Our vision for the bill, and this doesn't sound too lawyer-like, was a reasonable inspection under the circumstances, that the judge goes in there and does a look around, and yes, they're not electrical engineers, they don't have fancy equipment to check for things, but just one more step they do in their preparation of the polling place. But again, if the body thinks that language should be modified somewhat, that it might place too much responsibility on an election judge, we're perfectly accepting of that, obviously.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Representative Howell.
Try that again. Thank you, Chair. I have two questions, if that's okay. One is, I guess I would just kind of chime in on previous comments that I am a little bit concerned about the idea of having the supervising judge check the poll book, just because, and just so that everybody's clear, just in case anybody's not, a poll book, an electronic poll book is basically essentially a tablet. And so if you pick up a tablet, especially as a non-IT expert or someone who can be of any age, might be quite elderly, for example, working as a supervising judge, or not an electronic engineer, as you said, being able to verify whether or not that has internet access or not, seems very nebulous and hard to create guidance on, in my mind, and maybe you have ideas that I haven't thought of. And I would be concerned that they would be worried that they could be liable if there was something that they missed. So that's just something that just is a little bit of a small amount of a red flag of concern for me. And I'm very supportive of this bill and overall. Those are just kind of my thoughts on that. And if you have any comments about that, please chime in, of course. Then my other question is, if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, an electronic poll book basically verifies, when you give them your ID and it scans it, it verifies you are a registered voter in the state of Kansas, and then it checks you in, basically. It says, this person checked in to vote. And then the electronic poll book tells you what precinct you vote in, what ballot you get, okay? So then the election workers know what ballot to give that voter. But then after that, the poll book is done. The poll book doesn't know anything about how that person votes or anything that happens after that. So it's my understanding the poll book itself does not actually have any paper, whereas the voting machines, at least some of the voting machines like we use in Sedgwick County, once I get the information for what ballot I get as a voter, the appropriate ballot for me, based on where I live, then I get ballot paper, and I go to the machine and I select my correct ballot to vote on. I feed the paper in the machine, I make my selections, I double check my selections, then I hit print and it prints what I voted for on my paper ballot, and then it ejects it out and I read it and I can double check it again, and then I can enter it in the tabulator. So that machine has a paper backup. I mean, I have a paper backup that I get to read and check myself, so, which is awesome. I love that. I just wanted to make sure that I thought it was good to maybe explain that, because sometimes I think people get confused between what the two jobs are of the two different machines, and make sure that I did understand it correctly.
Well, you understood it perfectly, Representative, and thank you for that. Again, the poll book is just where you check in. I am Clay Barker, and I would scan my driver's license. It would come up on the screen. They make sure I'm the correct person. If there's more than one precinct at the polling place, it makes sure you get issued the right ballot. That's the only function of the poll book, and it keeps a record of who's checked in. The voting equipment is completely separate from that. The ballot, the counting the ballots. So they're two different types of equipment. I know sometimes people will read our election standards guidance and think that a poll book is a type of voting machine, and it's not. They're two different functions, two different types of equipment. And Representative, to answer your question, every county can be a little bit different on the ballots, but essentially, if you have tabulators at the polling place, which most of the big ones do, there's a paper ballot that will be transferred to the election office, but the count that comes out on election night is on a very high security stick that's put into the tabulator and taken out, and it's taken physically to the county. It's never transferred online, put into a counter there, and that's where we get all the voting data. And then the paper ballot is the backup. The audit compares the paper ballots to what the tabulators said to make sure they're the same. But that voting data, how the votes came out, is never transferred online over the internet or over a network.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Lee, I'm going to put it on the microphone so it's on the record. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Clay, for your presentation. So a couple things, actually 2 questions. So I'm going to start with this one. Based on the the representative to my left's explanation. So the electronic elements to this process. So there is Elvis, correct, which is the master online voter registry. Is that correct? There's Elvis, and then there's the poll books. That's electronic, and then the actual election machines, which you feed the ballot into. Is that also called a tab? You just mentioned tabulator. Is that the same thing? Is that synonymous?
It depends on the county, but there's one machine, if they have this, where you vote on it, tap the screen, or you can fill it out by paper, and the machine will kick out a paper ballot, then that's taken over and put in a tabulator, which then
So those could be separate.
can be separate, and Mr. FIFO might be able to give a little more detail on the mechanic, but they're usually separate.
Okay, so the electronic elements, though, that are going to be potentially connected or could be connected to a server of some sort. So you have Elvis and you have the poll books, and that's it. Then the machine and the tabulator are not electronic,
Right, they're not connected to anything else.
ever.
ELVIS is the acronym for our voter registration database, which I'll talk about in the next bill.
Okay, perfect.
And that gets
I just needed to
loaded
make
into the
sure
poll.
for my own understanding which pieces that are electronic and potentially could be like tied to a server or are tied to a server. Okay, perfect, thank you. Then I guess my question is, can the Secretary of State's office guarantee 100% that neither of those electronic pieces could ever be hacked? 100% never be hacked.
No, we can never guarantee 100%. The secretary and the elections chief go down to the skip with the National Guard about once a month and get briefed on foreign actors that are trying to penetrate the election system, and it's top secret, they can't talk about it, but North Koreans, Chinese, Russians.
Right. I had a feeling that's what you would say, because the Department of Defense, the CIA, our government, multi-billion-dollar companies are hacked every day. Our information is exposed every day. And I guess I'm wondering, there's 28 states that do not use poll books. And so I'm curious to know if ever it would be possible for us to not use poll books. Because to me, I'd rather have my credit card data hacked than my vote exploited. And so I'm just curious to
Representative,
know. Yeah.
so what is your question?
So my question is, I wanted to know from the Secretary of State office if it was 100% guaranteed that we can never be hacked, which obviously it's not, and then what the process would be if we would ever go to paper poll books again, or paper, we have, in my county, I've never seen a poll book because everything's on paper. So is that possible for us to go back to paper? That's my question.
So, Representative, so your question is, could we go back to paper poll books? Yes, we could. The larger counties, the lines at the polling places would be much longer, or we'd have to have a lot more check-in stations, because the poll book the electronic does speed it up immensely.
But they're not 100% guaranteed they couldn't be hacked, right?
Could not
The
give
poll books.
100%. Although we believe that the voting system, the Elvis database, has never been hacked. And the reason we want to certify the poll books is to ensure that they have the highest security standards possible placed on them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I actually have a question. I think I know the answer to this, but as far as the voting machines, is there some kind of a sticker or something on them that would break, like a seal, that if someone were to open up the machine and try tampering with the, maybe, and I know it's not very likely to happen because I know that they're kept under lock and key or supervised when they're not, but is there like some kind of a seal on it that would alert people that if it's been tampered with?
Yes, the machines are sealed. They're supposed to be kept secured, and only people with the proper clearance are allowed to open them. If somebody without the clearance tries to open the machine, and this has happened in other states where they think there's going to be some modem in there, that machine must be taken offline and never used again, or turned into a training machine.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to ask a couple questions to shine light on what the representative, two representatives ago was talking about, and I have the deepest respect for her, so this isn't in any way attacking her very legitimate concerns. So hypothetically, a poll book got hacked and a name was added. What is the mechanism by which a human would actually come in and get a ballot for that now fake name that's in the poll book?
Well, they'd have to have voter ID, so they'd have to show a driver's license that had the name and the address to match it. That's the correct person.
Okay, thank you. And if somebody wanted to if this hypothetical situation happened where a poll book was hacked and a name was added to it, how would somebody what information would some person have to provide to get a mail-in ballot under that nefarious added name?
So if they were added to the database improperly, they would have to submit an application with a signature and a driver's license number. So again, it's the photo ID, and the signature would have to match the registration form to make sure it's the.
And last question, if I could, Mr. Chair, if somebody's name was nefariously removed from a poll book and they showed up at the polling place to vote and were told their name wasn't in the book, would they still be able to vote?
Yes, they'd be given a provisional ballot. Anyone that shows up at a polling place and wants to vote, even if they're not on the poll book, or sometimes I'll say if they look like they're 6 years old and don't speak English, they can still get a provisional ballot. It may not count, but they would get the ballot and it would be determined back at the election office.
And then the mechanism by which a county clerk would verify that provisional ballot was actually a legitimate voter, how would they verify that?
They would look at the voter registration database and look at the forms that have been scanned in and verify that that's the correct person.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
The ballot would be counted.
Sure. Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important that we be as crystal clear as we can. I want to go back to one of the answers that Mr. Barker gave to Representative Lee, because I think he inadvertently misspoke when he said that the tabulators were not electronic.
They are electronic.
They are electronic. They're not hooked into any internet, but they operate electronically, and as far as them being hacked, they have paper backup. So I don't know how you could hack it and replicate paper ballots that have already been put into the tabulator. It's just, maybe my mind's too small to think that clever of a criminal, but I just don't conceive how you could even do it, because they're not connected to the internet, and we have paper backup to answer any unresolved questions like power outages, you name it. And that's remarkably better than we had a few years ago, because that was a deficiency that has since been corrected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Hammond, for a second time.
Thank you. So again, just to make sure my understanding is clear and to hopefully just provide clarity for all of us here on the committee, as a poll worker and as a supervising judge, I have worked elections in the past, both with electronic poll books and with paper poll books. And I would just like to offer my own personal experience and opinion, which granted that's what it is, okay, that paper poll books are much more prone to having errors, because what happens is we are human beings and we come in, we offer, first of all, we're depending on a human to look at our ID and say, oh, that ID looks legit to me, okay? That person looks like that person, okay? Or let's say, hopefully this would never ever happen, but let's say my neighbor next to me, who I've lived, who's lived next to me for 20 years, shows up and says, oh, I forgot my ID. Can I vote anyway? Okay, let's say that poll worker says, oh, sure, I know you are who you say you are. Okay, well, now we have someone who technically hasn't actually been legitimately checked in, okay? The other thing that happens is, as you all know, we have a Representative Howell here, and we have a Representative Howell here, up here in Topeka. And what happens is Howell and Howell will be next to each other on that poll book, on that paper poll book. And it's very, very easy to make a human error and sign the wrong line. And then we have a problem that has to be rectified in some way. So there are a lot of human error type potential problems with paper poll books that the electronic poll books, I would argue, eliminate. So I'm just putting that out there for the committee's consideration. And if you have anything to add, please feel free.
Do you have a question?
I want to double check. Voting machines do not have a server in them, correct?
I don't believe so. I'd have to kind of go off a definition of all.
And tabulators do not have a server, I do not believe.
Tabulators just count.
I say,
Scan and count ballots.
right. My toaster at home is electronic, but it cannot be hacked because it has no internet capability, but it is electronic. So there is a difference between something that is electronic and something that is hackable. Now, my crock pot has Wi-Fi. So I suppose if you wanted to try to turn my crock pot, I mean, I can turn my crock pot on and off from my phone, but I wouldn't argue that it's hackable. So I think it's important to just understand the difference between electronic and something that is also electronic and hackable. Those are not necessarily synonymous.
Mr. Barker, we appreciate your being here, and we've gotten good information from a lot of committee members, and we've gotten good information from you, and I would like to hear from Representative Lee. What is your question?
So here's an ironic twist. I'm sitting here and my message just came up that's never come up that says my phone has been hacked, which I find just ironic. I've shut it off and it's still saying it's hacked. So that's a real kick in the pants. Here's my question. Representative Proctor asked about a little bit ago so if, because nothing's 100%, if indeed a name was put in inadvertently to those poll books, or on purpose, but nefariously, what keeps because we know that ballot harvesting has happened. We know that tons of mail-in ballots have, people stuff the ballot box, whatever, drop boxes. Can you explain again how the check and balance would work if a name has been put in there that's a fake person, a dead person, whatever, and then they follow that up with, because one of the bills we had last year was that we prevented I don't even remember the specifics, but basically all these ballots that get sent out to people, that can't happen as much because a lot of folks were sending them from out of state, whatever. Anyway, how do we prevent, what did you say the mechanism was to ensure that the nefarious name and the ballot box that had gotten stuffed wouldn't marry up and create an actual vote that would be counted?
Make sure I answer your question. To do a mail ballot in Kansas, you have to send in an application. Now, the applications are mailed out all over the place, but unlike some states, Kansas never mails out a ballot unless it's been requested. And that application has to have the person's information, their signature that is compared with the signature on record. Everything you send to elections is scanned in. And also, you put your driver's license number on it or some other ID so they can verify that's really your driver's license. Somebody else probably wouldn't have your driver's license number. Then you get the ballot. If the ballot is mailed back in, that envelope again has a signature on it to verify it's the same person that asked for it. So it would be very difficult to just add a name to the voter registration list because somebody has to register first and they have to put in an application, get a ballot, and mail it back. Now, hacking, let's say somehow somebody managed to hack a poll book, that doesn't mean it's going to feed back into the database. The database is what populates the poll book. So somebody would have to get to the database first, and Elvis. And again, we've had no indication in Kansas history of anyone being able to get into the database. We also, in this last election and the others before it, have no evidence of a ballot coming in that had not been requested. It's not like mysterious people were just dumping ballots in a box and they show up and get counted. Each ballot has to be aligned with a request. So unlike California, for instance, that mails ballots to everyone on the list and they can come in if you want, in Kansas, you have to request the ballot.
Thanks, Clay.
Thank you, ma'am. Representative Topiker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when a person, let's see, on the certification issue, we mentioned that it's in paragraph F. I know we're not working the bill now, but I just wanted to bring this up because it was said in the definition of the bill earlier, but on and after July 1st, 2022, no board of county commissioners would purchase, lease, or rent any electronic poll book unless the kind and make of such poll books have been certified by the Secretary of State. I just wondered, that isn't current law then right now, that they shall be certified. I think you mentioned that it's not current law. Now, will they have to actually, will a vendor have to sign or swear, attest, or whatever in writing that any system that is purchased by a county doesn't have any connection? Do they have to sign something? The vendor have to say, we attest that this can't in any way be hooked up to the internet?
For election equipment, the voting equipment, they already do that. They have a certificate that says this cannot be connected to the internet. And we started doing that over the 2020 election because people were alleging that the machines were connected to the internet.
Okay, so that's a recent thing that the Secretary of State's office started doing policy-wise, but it's not law yet.
Not law yet. Now, again, poll books are different with the internet, but their certification would be similar. There'd be national standards. They would go through independent labs to be tested. Some states can afford their own testing labs. Kansas can't. So we rely on what other states have done, the national testing labs, and certification from the vendor, and then we can do anything else we want.
So certification of the vendor is what's going to, quote-unquote, guarantee that this is followed.
That and independent testing labs will back up that the poll book, for instance, meets the standards that we adopt.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And if there's no other questions for Mr. Barker, we will move on to our WebEx, Davis Hammond. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Bergquist, members of the committee. My name is Davis Hammond. I'm actually pretty excited to be able to be a proponent on these bills. I know I'm usually here as an opponent. I'm a proponent with a couple reservations and concerns I think you should look at. You've already discussed some of them, like the impact, how this would affect poll workers who are acting as judges and the responsibility of them doing inspections. I'm really excited that y'all are going to make a deadline for the electronic machine testing within 5 days of the canvass. Again, that sometimes gets drawn out many, many weeks after the election. But my concerns here are that there's no deadline related to the certification for the Secretary of State or them adopting the rules and regulations. And I want to point this out because a couple years ago, we had a situation where the committee had adopted a law or a law had passed the Kansas legislature, and it took multiple years for the Secretary of State to write those rules and regulations to be adopted. So it effectively undermined what the committee had done. But so I think it should be clear that when these guidelines and rules and regulations will be adopted, especially since it goes into effect on July 1st. So this will need to be adopted way early so that counties can know they're in compliance. The second part is ensuring that all 105 counties are capable of complying with these requirements right now, because any of the small counties that might not be able to immediately comply with this before the July primary and special election, the cost of updating this equipment is borne by them, not by the state. The state actually doesn't assist the counties really in any way in funding the election administration or equipment. Sometimes the state acts as a pass-through for the federal government. So I would just encourage y'all to make sure that all 105 counties are able to immediately comply with this before August, or it would essentially act as an unfunded government mandate from the state to the counties. With all that being said, I think this is a good bill, and I'm happy to support it. If y'all look at those minor concerns, I'm happy to stand for any questions. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Hammond. I think what was mentioned in the description by Mr. Heim was that bonding will be an available vehicle to pay for these for any of these cities, large or small, or counties, large or small, but it'll be an available means to be able to do it without having to have a capital outlay at the outset. That's just one thought. Yes.
May I respond, Mr. Chairman?
Certainly.
Thank you. I completely understand that. I would think that many members on this committee are also not exactly thrilled about their counties taking on more debt to do these things. But another concern of this that we saw in the 2020 election is sometimes certain election equipment is in extremely high demand under a short term. And so sometimes it's actually, even if you have the money, they won't be able to acquire the equipment in time before the election. So those are some additional concerns. And also the county clerks and county commissioners themselves can't make these purchases. They have to convince their county commissions to approve them, which sometimes can be an obstacle. And I know sometimes counties go through fights where the state's mandating that the clerk gets some stuff, but the county commission doesn't want to pay for it. So just those considerations. Again, it might not be an issue. All 105 counties might be prepared to do this, but it is a consideration.
Yes, Mr. Barker, do you have a response to that?
Hello, Davis. I don't know if you can see me. We took your concern into consideration. That's why the law only requires if they purchase electronic poll books, so they have to meet the certification. The current existing electronic poll books would be grandfathered in. And so knowing that poll books usually have a life cycle of about 3 years, we figured by then the counties would have to buy new ones anyway, and they just go off the certification. So this isn't you must get new ones within 6 months, if that answers your question.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Certainly.
All right, thank you. And I appreciate that, Mr. Barker. And I think that's actually what happened several years ago when the committee worked on implementing the voter verified paper trails on electronic machines. They did just what this bill apparently does, which the machines were grandfathered in, but as new machines were being bought, they had to be in compliance, which just took a couple years to roll out, but didn't rush any of the counties.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Hammond? Any questions for Mr. Hammond? All right. And do you have any other comments before you close your testimony?
I do not. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Now we have excuse me, go ahead. Yeah. Are there any other proponents before we move to opponents? Any other people in the audience that would like to speak to this as a proponent? All right. If not, we'll move on to opponents, and that is for your consideration. In your notes, you'll find written only McLean Bryant Macklin, Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives for the Health Forward Foundation. And if Mr. Bryant Macklin is not online, and if he would like to, if he is, then you're welcome to make any comment. Not seeing any. Okay. That will close the hearing. Excuse me. we'll go ahead, there are neutrals, and that's, neutral is Rick PFO, is that correct? PFO?
Sorry, is it on?
And
Rick Pifo.
FIFO, okay.
I am the Harvey County Clerk and Election Officer, and I'm also the Chair of the Elections Committee for the Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association, KCC-EOA. I'm also on the Executive Board of the KCC-EOA. And we've submitted neutral testimony. In most cases, I'd probably say we're actually a proponent. Most of the provisions of this we agree with. We feel it's appropriate to specifically put electronic poll books into statute. Right now, there's really nothing that governs them, bars them or says you have to have them. We just want to be assured that we can continue to use them because they are a very useful tool, especially as the counties get larger and larger. For us, if we were to do a paper poll book for an advanced voting, we have 23,000 voters. So I'd have to have a book that has all 23,000 voters in there. So it becomes really difficult especially for advanced voting. It's a little easier for polling places because the poll book, as Mr. Barker said, the polling places only have the number of names in them for people that are eligible to vote there. But paper poll books would virtually eliminate satellite advanced voting and or the new vote center concept. So we just want to make sure that the rules and regulations and the certification process isn't so strict that it basically eliminates them. We do like the fact that they're basically grandfathered in. We've been using electronic poll books since about 2012. We love them. They're a useful tool. They make everything go faster. Used to be paper poll books. We'd have to have all these different tables with at least 2 people per table, and we'd have A to C or whatever. And, so you could only check in at that table because they only had that part of the book. So if you came in and everybody else with a C was there at the same time, but there was no S's, you'd have to wait in line, but there's other tables that are open. Now with electronic poll books, you can go to any one of them. They all have the exact same data in them, and they communicate with each other. They don't specifically have to communicate on the internet. It's useful if they do, especially, they would have to for vote centers or satellite vote sites. But within the polling place, if they lose connectivity with the internet, they still talk to each other. So they know you can't go from one table to the other and check in again. We are a little concerned, that's why I think we're neutral, is what was brought up about the supervising judges having to prove a negative. It's really difficult to prove that something's not happening. And to be sure that you're clear that voting systems, tabulating are completely separate from checking in. And that we would need connectivity, Bluetooth, network, whatever, on tablets, but not on the actual equipment that you mark your ballot or that tabulates. As far as the question about the paper poll book backups, in my county at least, I create a paper poll book, but I don't usually print it out. I make sure that every poll site has at least 2 poll books, electronic poll books, so if one was to fail, they can use the other one. And we could print that paper poll book out and deliver it to the site if we needed to. But in an effort to save some paper, and we have it prepared, but don't necessarily deliver it to the site. Because sometimes they could get confused. They may do some on electronic and some on paper. And like I said, I make sure I have at least 2 at every site. And they do, our poll books are iPads, and iPads have batteries built into them. So the iPad continues to function if you lose power. In our case, we have a little printer that prints out a receipt that says what the proper ballot style is. Sometimes they can have a barcode on there that can be used on the ballot marking device to pull up the right ballot. to ensure that they're not getting the wrong ballot. So the printer wouldn't work, but we could write the ballot style on a Post-it note or something. But I think that's basically what I was trying to keep track of all the different questions, but so if I miss something, I'm willing to stand for questions.
I have one question to begin with, and this is just a logistical thing, but if I go to the polls and I'm planning to vote in the primary, and I identify myself, and they look at the poll book, and the poll worker, is there still a human error factor that they may give me the wrong precinct module?
That's all pre-programmed. What we do is we use Elvis, and Elvis is not used at the polling places because Elvis can only be used in county facilities. So Elvis is not used at the polling places, to clarify that. The only systems we would have is the poll book and the voting systems. But so we use Elvis to create the poll book, to create the database that's uploaded into the electronic devices. And the process is the poll book, usually we will scan your driver's license if you have a Kansas ID, but the poll book does not verify that your driver's license is correct. They still have to look at your picture and make sure that they verify the photo ID, which is in law. It's a convenience to scan the barcode because it has your name and birth date. So it looks at that data in the barcode and searches through the database to find the right person. If it can't find the exact right person because of a nickname or something, it'll show multiple choices, and then you can choose the right person from the database. The ballot style and everything is pre-assigned in Elvis before it's ever loaded into the system. So you should not be able to get an incorrect ballot unless a poll worker, if you were asking for a paper ballot and they happen to pull out the wrong one. But in our case, we use the receipt to trade it for a vote, basically. They take the receipt. In our case, our voters can vote either paper or electronic. We get about 50-50. 50% vote each way. So they can trade that. They take that receipt to the ballot table where there's paper ballots, and they trade this receipt for the proper ballot, or they take it to another clerk that would get them set up on the ballot marking device.
Representative Topliker.
Do you actually, or do the poll workers actually compare a signature on the electronic system to something else on the electronic system?
We don't currently. I mean, it's feasible that the signatures, depending on the poll book vendor, that the signatures could be exported from Elvis. But then there'd be a whole nother level of training of matching signatures and everything else.
So just real quick, do you ever get more votes than people that signed in at the end of the day? Like, well, all of a sudden we found out we have a few more votes than people that actually signed in on the poll books or were checked in.
I don't know how it would happen. I mean, unless they had access to the paper ballot table or unfettered access to the machines, it doesn't happen. No, we don't.
So you haven't seen that?
No.
Or heard of that? And then, but you could actually have more.
I mean, well, I'm thinking, one second.
Yeah.
It's possible that somebody was mailed an advance ballot and they brought the ballot itself with no envelope and dropped it into a can. But that's really, really rare. And people are watching in the polling place, because they can bring them to a polling place.
But you could actually have more voters.
We balance everything. It helps us, the poll book tells us how many people checked in, so we should have an equal number of ballots voted.
So you can have more voters than votes because of the provisional, so there's more voters that come in, but their votes don't count for that precinct. If they're provisional ballots, they might count somewhere else.
Well, no, I mean, for the polling place, they're still going to balance. If we sent them 100 ballots, they could have 50 paper ballots voted, 25 voted on the machine, 5 voted provisionally, and whatever the number is, 20 left over that are unvoted. So they have to bring us back 100 ballots, no matter how, whether they're unvoted, spoiled, provisional.
But they might bring you back more because people showed up that wasn't their polling place and they were allowed to vote anyway. So you might actually have more votes. That doesn't happen.
No, I mean, if they were allowed, if you're saying allowed to vote anyway, that's provisional. And
Right,
those
that's
would
what
be
I did.
accounted
Yeah,
for.
that's what I meant.
Those would be accounted for. If they issued a ballot style 1 provisionally, it's accounted for that a ballot style 1 was pulled out of the inventory.
Okay, so yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Pifo. Appreciate you being here.
No problem.
And we will, is there anyone else any kind of conferee for this bill before we close this hearing? All right. If not, we'll move on to hearing for HB 2486, House Bill 2486. And say again, oh, that's what we just got done with, guys. 2555. Thank you, sir. Please, if you would give a brief description, Mr. Hahn. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is a bill dealing with voter registration rolls and so on. The amendment appears on page 2. It deals with a provision in the current law that provides the county election officer where they were required to send a confirmation notice out to a person that has registered to vote within 45 days of an event, and there's 4 current events, and this bill would add a 5th one. If the registrant has no election-related activity for any 4 calendar year period, and it defines this election-related activity to mean the elector has not voted, attempted to vote, requested or submitted an advance ballot application, filed an updated voter registration card, signed a petition, which is required by law to be verified by the county election officer or Secretary of State, or responded to any official election mailing transmitted by the county election office. That's the bill.
We have 2 proponents that are listed. The first proponent is Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
And sir, before you get started, I'd like to ask the committee, and I've been guilty myself, but if we can keep our questions towards the specific goal of the bill. We've done some general discussions of how elections work, and that's valuable, but we'll be short on time in the next hour or so. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will attempt to be brief. So I don't know if my colleagues here have had the same experience, but in Leavenworth, when I go around and I knock doors, I'm using a list derived from the voter registration. And when I go up to a door, frequently, the names of the 2 people who live there, the 2 people who lived there before them, and the 2 people who lived there before them are all listed at that address. And so this bill attempts to help clean that up a little faster than it's currently being cleaned up. Currently, there are 4 reasons that a county clerk, in our Kansas statute, there are 4 reasons that a county clerk is allowed to send a confirmation notice to a voter to see if they're still at that address. The first of those reasons is if they send election mail and it comes back undeliverable, they're allowed to send a confirmation notice. The second reason is if they get a notice of a change of address form sent from the voter to the U.S. Post Office. They can send a confirmation notice to see if that voter is still there. And then the final reason, or a third reason, is if they get any other information from the Postal Service telling them that the voter has moved outside of the county, they can send a confirmation notice. When they send that confirmation notice, if it comes back undeliverable, it starts a clock. And if there's no voting activity from that voter over the next 3 to 4 years, election-related activity, and I'll go through what that means in a minute, but if there's no election-related activity, they can, for 3 to 4 years, they can remove the voter from the voter rolls. There's a fourth reason to send a confirmation notice, and that's if the U.S. Postal Service notifies them that the voter has moved within the county. And if the U.S. Postal Service notifies the clerk that they've moved within the county, they send a confirmation notice, and if they get that back, they change the address for the voter to the address that they've been notified for. What this bill does is it creates a fifth reason to send that confirmation notice. And I want to be very clear about that because it doesn't create the reason to remove them from the rolls. It creates the reason just to send a confirmation notice. And I think some of the objections to this bill are confused about that. The fifth reason is if there's no election-related activity for 4 years. If a voter hasn't done one of these activities I'm going to go through for 4 years, the clerk is allowed to send the notice under this bill, is allowed to send the confirmation notice. If that thing doesn't come back, it starts the same clock that the other confirmation notices start of 3 to 4 more years before you can remove a voter. So under this bill, it would be 7 to 8 years before you could remove a voter from the rolls. I wish that it could be faster, but we are somewhat constrained by case law and by federal voting laws that we can't do it any faster than that. So these are the voting activities, the election-related activities that are defined in the bill. If the voter votes, if the voter attempts to vote, if the voter requests or submits an advance ballot application, if the voter files an updated registration card. I did not realize that this is a statute, but if a voter signs a petition which has to be verified by a county election officer, that is election-related activity. Next, if the voter responds to any election mailing at all, that is considered from the election office, that is considered a election-related activity. And if any of those things has occurred, the clerk's not allowed to send this confirmation notice because they've engaged in activity that confirms that they're where they're registered to vote from. The final thing I would say before I stand for questions is that there is case law on this. I think it was 2018, the Supreme Court rendered in an opinion on another case that this is a legitimate reason to confirm that a voter is at this address. So this is a conservative bill, not in the sense of, conservative versus liberal, but conservative in the sense that this is a pretty reasonable bill to try to clean up our voter rolls. I wish it was more aggressive, but this is, we're constrained by case law and by federal voting laws.
Would you relate the word cautious to the conservative?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That's a better word. I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will stand for questions.
Questions for the contrary? Representative Miller.
Not a question, but I just want to simplify your testimony for people's edification. Because what we're getting in our emails and what I suspect from a number of these opponents that are listed here is that they are reading this bill as saying that if you have 4 years of inactivity, your name comes off. That is not correct. If you have 4 years of inactivity, the clerk, election office can send you a confirmation, and if it comes back, meaning it was undeliverable at that address, then the clerk can remove your name. I'm on your side. This is not the boogeyman that many people believe it is, because they're equating it to proposals like the one I just described from the past. So I hope that helped.
Can I respond quickly, Mr. Chair?
Thank you, Representative Miller.
I do want to correct one thing that you said, Representative. If there's no election activity for 4 years and they send the confirmation notice and it comes back undeliverable, they still have to wait 3 to 4 more years after that before they can remove you from the voter rolls. So it's actually 7 to 8 years before. So it's even more cautious than that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
By those markers, they can still remove you if something pops up in between then that verifies, like an obituary or anything else. But without any other indicators, you'd have that possible 7 or 8 years.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Chair.
Representative Topiker.
I just wondered, how does this work with other states, and what if somebody really did move and they're voting in another state, and do they still stay on the roll for 8 years?
Thank you for the question, Representative. If I'm going to defer to the Secretary of State's office to make sure that what I'm telling you is correct, but election offices talk to each other, and if somebody registers in another spot, that sends a notification to where they used to be registered and they're removed from the rolls. There's a process for that. I do not know if it's interstate. I will have to defer to the Secretary of State's office for that. But the intrastate, that's a mechanism that's in statute and that we use now.
And a nod of the head from the Secretary of State's office for a start. Is that correct? Essentially, okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Representative.
Any other questions for me, sir? I'm standing for questions.
Representative Osman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This may be a question more for the revisor, but can you point in here where it does say that there's an additional 3 to 4 years? Or is it reference to another law?
But yeah, the revisor is welcome to rescue me, but this refers to a statute that it specifies that. And I think that also federal law requires that.
We can ask the revisor when he's available again for your edification. Thank you, Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Move on to the next conferee, and that will be Clay Barker. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right. So as Representative Proctor briefed the committee, this is about voter roll maintenance. The voter roll is the keystone, the foundation for the management of elections. It assigns voters to the correct precinct so they know what ballot they're supposed to get. It's the basis for the county's logistical planning to know how many voters are assigned to a precinct. It has the history of the voter so they know whether they vote by mail or not, so they can make predictions. And it also helps candidates like all of you know who your voters are, so you can message them, visit them, canvass them. Now, before 2006 in Kansas, each county maintained its own voter rolls separately, and some did a better job than others. In 2006, this was centralized under the Elvis database. Now, essentially, each county is responsible for its own voters, so only that county can change the voters on its database. At the Secretary of State's office, we can see the database. We can't change anything in it if somebody sees something odd about it. Now, it's important that the database be as accurate as possible for the reasons I stated. It's also imperative that we do not remove a properly registered voter inadvertently. And the system is designed that if it's going to make a mistake, it's going to keep someone on the database that should have come off rather than remove somebody who should be on. And I want to make this clear that not voting is never a reason to take someone off the database. I've heard things about if you don't vote, you'll lose your right. That's not true. You could register 80 years ago, and if you're still alive in the same place and never had voted, you're still a registered voter. And just the voter roll maintenance activity is constant and ongoing at our office. Just remember, about 1% of the voters die every year, plus or minus, and about 10% of Americans, I don't know what Kansas's numbers are, move every year. And if they move far enough away, they need to be reassigned on the voter rolls. I understand how sensitive this issue is, and as an example, Johnson County doing the normal voter roll maintenance after a federal election in 2021, after the 2020 election, removed about 4% of their voters, and I'll explain why they did that. And if you looked at the voter numbers, they just dipped, and that happens in every county. They do it at different times. And immediately, one side of interested citizens said, oh, they're purging the rolls, they're getting eligible voters off, and another mirror image group of interested citizens said, oh, those are phantom voters, it's vote fraud, and they're trying to get rid of the evidence. And neither is true. Those are inactive voters that met the federal criteria to be removed. This is not a reaction to any problem that came up in 2020. It's after discussions with other states. They found this to be a useful tool to help manage their voter rolls. And it's not a sudden shift. There's not going to be any large decrease in voters because of this. And as Representative Proctor mentioned, it was approved by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Husted in 2018. And in that case, they'd only waited 2 years before they sent the confirmation notice out. We're going with 4, mainly because a third of the voters in Kansas only vote in a presidential election general, about 400,000. And if we did a 2-year period, we'd be sending confirmation notices out to those people, and it would probably be wasting money. Okay, really quickly, the current process to eliminate or remove voters from the voter rolls. One group of reasons is where you have direct evidence that the voter should not be there. The primary is the voter tells you that. They sign the letter, sign it, and say, I've moved somewhere else, please take me off the voter roll. Or they may be responding to something we send out saying, are you still there? And when I say we, I mean the counties, not the Secretary of State. And it comes back. Second is death. It is possible to be dead and be on the voter roll, but it's rare because we look for obituaries are a reason for a county to remove a deceased voter. Anytime a death certificate is issued in Kansas, the database from Vital Statistics weekly interacts with our database, and the counties are told to remove those individuals. And every year we get the Social Security Death Index. If somebody dies outside of Kansas, we may have to wait a little while if you're at a hospice in Missouri or Oklahoma and you pass away, and then those names are taken off. The only reasons that I've brainstormed with Vital Statistics on this, because we get a lot of complaints, people think there's a lot of deceased individuals on the voter rolls, is if somebody dies and you don't tell anyone, bury them in the backyard, or sometimes if there's an obituary or someone has died but you're waiting for a autopsy. That can take quite a while, and a death certificate won't be issued till they have a cause of death. So somebody could sit there for a while. Felony convictions is the third reason. Both state and federal update us constantly when someone is convicted of a felony, and we check that against the voter roll. And the last is if somebody moves, and Representative Proctor, where I said you essentially got it, if they move inside Kansas from one county to another. Now, when they re-register in the new county, it should come off the old county. Occasionally that doesn't happen, but then annually we do a scrub of our database to make sure the same person isn't on there twice. Sometimes they may use a slightly different name and it doesn't catch the first time. But inside Kansas, we talk to each other. If somebody moves outside the state, we no longer have a real way of finding them in the other state. And there's nothing wrong with being registered in 2 states, just don't vote in 2 states. The second type of reason for someone to come off is there's substantial evidence, that's my word, it's not set in statute, but a lot of evidence that the person's moved. And the federal law requires a lock and key, sort of 2 provisions. One is that a confirmation notice has been sent out and it comes back undeliverable. That's an indication that person doesn't live there anymore. Not that it's been forwarded, not that it just went into a trash can and died. It has to come back undeliverable. And is the key word, you wait 2 federal election cycles. That's usually 3 or 4 years, so that includes a presidential race, and there's no election activity. So the question then becomes, it's up to the states, what causes the county to send this confirmation notice out? And it's a postage prepaid form. Every county has a little different version, and it asks you if you still live there, and to fill out some information, you seal it and send it back. And Kansas had the 4 reasons that Representative Proctor went over. One of them is the national change of address list. Only 40% of people that move actually fill that out. And every year we get that list and compare it to our voter rolls and then send confirmation notices out. But they're all postal based. It could be sending a mail ballot out to a voter and it comes back undeliverable. Ballots are not forwardable. It could be some other document that comes back. And this then brings us up to our proposal, which is to add a fifth reason. And hopefully in your testimony, you all have this colored chart that hopefully explain this and doesn't confuse it. And the fifth reason has to do with, instead of a mail-based reason, it's inactivity for 4 years. And that's just an indicator that someone may have moved. Not voting for 4 years is not a reason to take someone off the database. It's just this person may have moved. Now send out the confirmation notice. If it comes back undeliverable, wait 2 election cycles, like Representative Proctor emphasized, then they can be removed. So the question comes up 2 reasons. Why are we doing this? Like, who is sort of the reason? And from what we've learned from other states is it's 2 groups this would help correct the voter database. One is children who have moved out of state and they're using their parents' address as their voter residence. And that's because sometimes mail will go to the parents and it goes in the trash or they forward it and nobody actually asks, please update this voter registration. The parents will send it to the kids and they may update it. The other is apartments where sometimes, like Representative Proctor said, you can have 2 or 3 families registered at the same apartment sometimes. You know only one really lives there. And it's because they just have never responded to anything else and it takes a while to get them off. The other question that comes up is it's 7 to 8 years. That's a really long time. What we found from talking to other states is often sending the confirmation notice itself after that 4-year period, people will respond to that and ask to be taken off the voter database. If they're asked, do you still live there because you're still a voter in our state, they'll actually respond and say, no, please take me off. So it can actually be a shorter period. But again, there you have a voter telling us to take them off. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation. I think Representative Proctor did a great job of explaining what voter activity is and that this is really, we're trying to make a cautious, measured approach and just give one more tool to the counties to keep their voter databases updated. And I'll stand for questions.
All right. I don't see any questions, but I'm going to recognize Representative Topliker.
There used to be people used to say, well, if you move, you're required under law to re-register. And was that an old law before some federal law overrode it? Or is there a law in place that says that if I moved, I'd have to re-register in my new place? Is that a law?
Representative, I'm not aware of any law that forces someone to register to vote in a new location. It's the voter's duty to re-register if they want to vote, especially if they move into a different county.
And I think the idea was that if you didn't re-register, then you couldn't vote. And that never was a law that was overridden by HAVA or something else.
That's what you just said there is correct. If I move from Johnson County to Shawnee County and I don't re-register, I can't just show up in Shawnee County and vote. I'm not registered in Shawnee County. In Kansas, the county is the voting jurisdiction. So you have to be registered in your county in order to vote. If you move out of county, you're out of luck. If you move inside the county, you can get a partial provisional if you don't re-register.
So what we're under now is a Supreme Court case which doesn't allow in some situations for us to remove a voter for 8 years.
Well, the Supreme Court case was Ohio. It adopted a policy that their Secretary of State could come up with uniform, non-discriminatory criteria that don't violate the Voting Rights Act to send these confirmation notices out. And the policy Ohio adopted was 2 years of voter inactivity. Some states do this every year. It costs a lot of money. We decided to do 4 years, which was less intense than Ohio, to save the county's money on this. But the Supreme Court said that is okay as a reason to send out the confirmation notice, and it's federal law takes over. Confirmation notice, 2 federal election cycles, then the voter can be removed because there's enough evidence they've likely moved to a different location.
Thank you.
Representative Smith and then Representative Meyer for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm guilty. You talked about a son that moves out of state, and that happened with me. My son moved out of state, and I get a request for a vote for him, and I threw it in the trash. And I can't call and take him off the rolls, So I realize you were saying this, but what should I do to take him off the rolls?
Yes, and to follow up on that, it has to be the voter asking to be taken off, and it usually is a signed document. They'll put their date of birth. There's no particular form. I can't call in and say, take my kid off, or my parent died, take them off. Your son could write to the county election officer and say, I'm this name, and sign it. They'll compare the signature to the registration, and please take me off. I've moved out of state.
I think it's a good idea. I think most people wouldn't do that, and I really needed his vote, but I didn't use it. So thank you.
Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a few concerns about this, but my first, really, what would happen if a voter who had not voted in the previous 8 years came to the polls to cast their ballot? Am I to understand that they would be offered a provisional ballot?
Yes, anyone who attempts to vote, if they're not on the voter roll at the polling place, would cast a provisional ballot. They'd fill out the ballot, it'd be put in an envelope, and on the outside it'd be written why.
Okay. I do understand that. So with the provisional ballots, can you kind of explain how that vote curing or certification process works, and how the individual who did vote provisionally has to certify that vote if they are not currently on the rolls?
Well, it would depend on the reason it's provisional. For instance, a name change can be taken care of right away. Failure to sign an advance ballot, you could go back in and sign it. If they're just not on the rolls and that person just wasn't registered, the provisional would not be counted. And you've probably seen in Johnson County where they put out the list from the county canvas. Here's all the provisionals that were counted and the reason why. Here's the ones that weren't counted and the reason why. And a common one is not registered. Either the person thought they were registered, or they've moved and there's some mistake.
Right. So that kind of goes back to my concern here. I do know of several people who vote infrequently, although I try to get them to vote more frequently all the time. Some folks only vote in presidential. Some folks choose not to vote in certain presidential elections every 4 years. So my concern is that for young voters in particular, or folks who are less engaged, that they would not have the opportunity to have their vote counted if they were to, say, vote in the 8th year. Am I correct that that's true?
Yes, but if I can add in.
Absolutely.
So it has to be extended period of no activity at all, combined with an official mail was sent that came back undeliverable, which indicates the person no longer lives at that address. And pragmatically, the counties will be sending other things to that address in that 8-year period. It could be notices of where your polling place is, it could be ballots for an all-mail ballot election. So there's usually several pieces of evidence that the person no longer lives there. It'll come back addressee unknown. And remember, if it just gets thrown away or gets forwarded, that does not trigger this confirmation notice. It has to come back undeliverable from by the Postal Service.
But can you kind of explain what may happen to an individual if they were to encounter that? It occurs to me that it could be, and I don't want to use this word, but it could be voter disenfranchisement. And that worries me, because we have quite a few people who just are not that engaged. And I understand that this is really to clean up the voter rolls, and that will be helpful to us in our campaigning, and for other reasons, but it really concerns me. And I'd like to understand a little bit more why we think that this is so important to do.
Again, it was an idea that we received from other states that have done something similar. And they said it just helped them with small, I'm not sure what the right wording is, like niche groups of individuals that no longer live at their registered address, but they weren't able to be identified by the system. This is just another tool for counties. And again, we don't foresee a large number of people coming off for this. But again, it's two things. Evidence from the Postal Service, they don't live at the address anymore, combined with an extended period of not voting. And I understand the presidential, I think I mentioned 1/3 of Kansas voters only vote in the presidential general. That's about 400,000 people out of the 1.2 million that vote in a presidential year. So some people, yes, don't vote, but again, not voting is never a reason to take someone off. It's got to be the combination of not voting and pretty good evidence that they no longer live at that address. Now, I could probably come up with hypotheticals of someone that doesn't vote, changed their name, the Postal Service didn't realize it and sent it back. And I know especially the smaller counties will actually make additional efforts to contact voters just because they have the means to do that. Call them up, some people even go visit to make sure that that person doesn't live there before they take them off.
Just one last thing, and then I'll be done here. So it sounds like what you just said as well is that it doesn't happen very often. So if it doesn't happen that often, what is the need for this?
Again, it was just an idea that other states have used and found it useful for identifying groups of voters that the other four means to send this confirmation notice out didn't identify.
Thank you.
Representative Miller.
Just one additional augmentation. When you vote provisional, part of the process is you register to vote. So if there are address problems, whatever caused the difficulty, it gets corrected once those provisionals and the accompanying registration form are processed. It's a very convenient way for people to still vote within the county, do it provisionally, and assure that now they're on the books at the right address. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Barker. And now we will move on to opponents. Is Caleb Smith in attendance, Inclusive Campaign Director for the Kansas Appleseed for Law and Justice. Thank you for your attendance, sir. If you'll state your name for the beginning. Thank you.
My name is Caleb Smith. I am the Kansas Appleseed Inclusive Campaign Director. And thank you, members of the House Committee, for allowing me just a few minutes to discuss this bill. I'll keep this very brief because I know that we're running a little bit over time, but Kansas Appleseed is opposing HB 2555. This bill allows for registered voters to be removed from the registration list, essentially because they did not participate in recent elections, and also for moving. This bill goes beyond just ensuring accuracy of voter rolls, which, as someone who works encouraging people to vote, I understand the need for clean data, but this goes beyond that. It suppresses the voice of many Kansans. The new provisions added in HB 2555 simply amplifies disparities in voter participation. Removing voters based off voter history has the potential to impact a huge portion of the electorate in Kansas. As many as 50% of voters don't vote in certain federal election years, and frankly, black and brown communities living below the poverty line, and younger people are particularly at risk for being impacted by this policy. In fact, simply because these communities are more likely to move. These Kansans should not have to risk losing their right to vote simply because their residential address fluctuates. Rural voters, in fact, I come from Pittsburgh, Kansas, and I work with Southeast Kansas voters particularly, face similar barriers that make it harder for them to vote already. In fact, the accessibility, just to give an example of another barrier to vote, of polling places can bring down voting averages exponentially. In fact, for every mile that a polling place is moved from a voter, they decrease the likelihood of that voter voting by 1.1%. And that's just one example of a barrier decreasing voter participation. So in conclusion, removing inactive voters is a poorly targeted choice to ensure that voter roll accuracy is maintained. And even though I understand the need to maintain voter data, it is simply just disenfranchising voters is not a high enough good to maintain this. That's it. I'll end there, and if there's any questions, I can stand for them.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Do have one question for you. Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on many occasions, as we've proposed or heard legislation in this room, I've heard folks say that this measure or that measure disproportionately impacts populations, people of color. And so I would like to ask why you think that people of color are somehow less capable of following the voting laws than other people.
I mean, I think that's an interesting way to phrase it. We have lots of data that we could follow up with. I believe our written testimony has much of the data that shows that these communities, it's not that they are less capable, it's simply that they face more barriers just because of the world that we live in. It's an unfortunate fact, but I wouldn't phrase it or frame it as capability.
Mr. Chair, could I follow up? I realize time's short.
And as long as we don't get into a debate,
Yes.
we have a conferee.
So, you said that, I guess I don't understand why a person of color would be more likely to have returned mail from their address than any other person.
Well, we provided some statistics on it, and I'd love to be able to follow up with you to give some more statistics, but it's just the fact of the matter, these communities that we mentioned just simply move more.
Yeah, I'm not asking the data, I'm asking the mechanism. What is the mechanism by which a person of color is more likely to have return mail?
I'm just pointing out that that's just the fact, they move more, but also when these mechanisms go into effect, all the data shows that these are the communities that are in de facto, they're the ones that are affected the most by errors and when these systems go into place. You can see them in one of our footnotes that these communities are the ones that are affected the most by errors.
Thanks, sir. Representative Topiker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned that certain people would lose their right to vote under this proposed legislation, and I wonder how would they lose their right to vote? If after so many years they were taken off, couldn't they just re-register? How's that losing the right to vote?
Well, they could re-register. However, as we understand it at Kansas Appleseed, you can't, and maybe this is incorrect according to Representative Miller, but there's a waiting period typically to get back on the rolls. So you come back and you register, and you can't vote on registered day of if you're taken off, and there's a lead time between when you're taking off and when you go and vote.
Okay, and then on your you made another comment about suppressing votes of younger people and others. How would this legislation be suppressing their votes when they, in reality, are suppressing their own vote by not voting? How do you get that?
I mean, I think that's a way to frame it. I wouldn't say that you're suppressing your own vote if you don't vote. I think there's a difference between voter suppression and just not voting for 7 years.
I can't see where it's voter suppression. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Miller, then Representative Collins.
Here's the flaw in what I hear you saying is that I don't think you're acknowledging that when someone moves and doesn't re-register, they're no longer entitled to vote. But if you change your residence and do not re-register, you're not entitled to vote from that other residence, the one you're registered under. Do you believe that when a person registers to vote, that entitles them to just keep voting no matter where they move to?
Well, no, of course not. However, there are errors in the system. I'm saying that sometimes people get these notices, they just don't pick it up, they don't get it in the mail, and they still live there, they go to vote, and there's a problem.
Yeah, but it only comes back if they have a different address and the letter is undeliverable. If they don't bother to pick it up, that's different. If they throw it in the basket, it's when it comes back, which means they have notified the post office that that no longer is their address, so they do not live there.
Theoretically, however, this has gone into effect in other states, and there is a lot of evidence that that errors were made and made consistently.
And that's called provisional ballots.
Thank you, Representative Miller. And Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, I'd like to talk to you after the meeting about something that's not relevant to this discussion. But it was mentioned by the Secretary of State's office that simply not voting does not cause you to be not registered anymore. So even if by some error a person's name was taken off the rolls that had not voted for a while, couldn't they go through the provisional process like Representative Miller mentioned, and they would be re-registering at the time they cast the provisional ballot?
I mean, that is not how we understood the bill as it was written. That's not how it seems to work in other states, but we could follow up with you on that, and we could check out to make sure to see if that's accurate.
Okay, well, thank you, but like I said, because it's happening that way in other states doesn't mean it's happening that way here. But like I said, I would like to discuss something else with you after the meeting, but thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence, and I promise this is the last one for this conferee. So the Supreme Court in 2018, looking at a law that was less cautious than this one, that allowed the sending of the confirmation notice after only 2 years, they found that law constitutional and in keeping with the National Voting Rights Act. So can you tell me where did the Supreme Court get it wrong?
I would not say that the Supreme Court made a legal mistake. I'm simply arguing that this is bad policy. And there is a difference between the two.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony. Appreciate your time and your patience in getting to testify yourself. We're moving on to Mike Burgess, Director of Policy and Outreach, Disability Rights Center of Kansas. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Please state your name just for the record.
Sure, Mike Burgess, and as you so eloquently stated, I'm the Director of Policy and Outreach at the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. And I very much appreciate the clarifications in from some of the previous conferees as far as some of the processes that would happen. That helps on some aspects of our concerns. I think there still are likely to be some populations that are more likely to be impacted by this. And so certainly there are a number of individuals with disabilities. To qualify for some of the federal programs, you have to be impoverished. And just the nature of folks who have to live on, $700 or $800 a month, they end up having to move more often. That being said, one of the provisions of our Kansas registration, you have to live in a residence to establish your residency and your right to vote. It can also be, there's a piece that allows for, or somewhere where you intend to return. And so often the examples are students or sometimes seniors who intend to return to a location. So this is kind of more food for thought. You do have individuals who do fully intend to return to that location. For various reasons, the mail, there could be, as I point in my testimony, there may be very good reasons if they have a serious brain injury or other cognitive impairment or medically fragile, that they do spend a prolonged period of time away from a specific residence. There are a number of cases where that mail then may be returned as non-deliverable, even though this voter very well intends to return. So I think at some point we're dealing with the margins, but it's our job as a Disability Rights Center to point out cases where individuals with disabilities may have their rights infringed. And so that's why I appreciate the opportunity here to share. I do think, again, in cases too, there's a lot of discussion last session on, I think it's more on the Senate side, about individuals who are homeless and registering to vote and their ability, they have a residence that they've established, even though they're homeless. And going through that process to be able to register to vote, they would clearly not be able to receive mail at that location. It would come up deliverable. So those individuals, and again, unfortunately, the situation, if they're, they're not going to be notified that they're no longer on the voter rolls. So if that person does show up to vote on election day, their only remedy is to vote provisionally. And as was previously discussed, if your name is not on the voter registration rolls, that vote is not going to count. And so, like I said, I think we're getting down the way a little bit. And I'm very sympathetic as a former elected official who has gone to houses and experienced the same thing. That, I totally understand that problem. But, as you're enacting policy or considering policy, you need to understand the ramifications in some of the individuals that might be caught up in this. Again, fully, if they intend to return to that spot, they establish residence, they should be entitled to vote based upon the current laws. And I think that's, you need to, through your deliberations, figure out how if there's a mechanism to reconcile that process. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
This is the appropriate time, and if you would stand, I appreciate that. Do we have any questions?
Just one.
For Mr. Burgess. Representative Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Would that person be able to re-register if they so choose to?
The issue is that if they present at the election site on election day, to the best of their knowledge, they were still registered to vote. I mean, the last time they voted, and they wouldn't have received the notice or been aware of that. At that point in the process, their only option is to vote provisionally, which would trigger a new registration, but it would not help them at that particular election.
But they would be able to re-register. They're not being, they would be able to vote provisionally and they would be able to re-register. Yes.
But their vote would not count, is the key piece.
But provisional ballots count. Provisional ballots count?
Well, their name would have been, unbeknownst to them, their name after going through this process, and again, it's a 7-year process roughly, it would have been removed from the poll books. Only this voter would not be aware of that. So at that point, that provisional ballot would not count, I believe, as a testimony. We have other experts who can testify to that. But if they're not in the poll books and they vote provisionally, that provisional ballot would not count.
Representative Miller.
Actually, if they can show their name was removed improperly, the Board of Canvassers can count that ballot.
Thank you for your testimony. Does anyone else care to have a question? Okay. Okay. On WebEx, we have, is Mr. Hammond still available for his testimony? President of Loud Light Civic Action.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. All right, I'll try to be brief. I know this has gotten quite late now. So thank you for hearing my testimony. I have a lot of concerns about this bill, which is essentially a voter purge bill. One thing I do want to correct, or I'd like Mr. Barker to correct it if he thinks I'm wrong here, but it is not the case that that the mailer that they send you has to come back undeliverable for you to be deleted. It actually says has failed to respond to the notice. This is a significant thing because it means that, if you live in a place like Shawnee County, the election office sends you cards reminding you of your registration every single year. And the cards usually say things like, contact us if anything's changed. You just throw those things in the trash. If you got another card that just looks like that, just a little different, you're going to throw it in the trash. That would be the one notice you have that they're about to delete your voter registration. How this would really play out, though, for example, would be if you voted in 2008. Well, then if you showed up to vote in 2018 and you didn't vote between there because you didn't like any of the candidates, you didn't care. I know it can be hard for the representatives in this room and the people who follow this stuff to realize that a lot of people don't follow politics that heavily or aren't super involved in this. But you voted in 2008, you show up in 2018 and you can't vote. If you do cast a provisional ballot, it's not going to count. So your vote is thrown out. You have been disenfranchised even though you were registered to vote. This would also be true on another timeline. Think about 2010. And I think for some of the members here, if you think of 2010, maybe you're someone who never voted and then the Tea Party revolution was going on. You got really excited. You voted in 2010 and then you didn't vote again until 2020. Maybe they were excited about one of you running, and they show up to vote and, oh, wow, they're not on the voter roll. Their vote's going to be thrown out. This would be purging voters, many of whom will be people who actually do live there. and there will be no way to cure their vote when they show up to vote. Their vote will not be counted. And as Representative Miller said, when he talked about being able to go to contest this or go to the canvassers, the thing is, you wouldn't have been improperly removed, because how the law is written, it is removing you based on a lack of election activity. And essentially, if you don't engage in elections for 8 years, then you're deleted out and you're disenfranchised by the state of Kansas. I did not have time because of there's over 20 election bills now in the legislature, but I plan to pull this data. We'll be able to find these people, and I'm sure there are thousands of Kansans who would have fallen in these gaps, and we can look at old election data and see who they are, and many of them are probably your constituents. 100%, this is going to disenfranchise Kansans wrongly who did everything right, were registered to vote, and they are only guilty of not wanting to vote for 8 years because no politician appealed to them for them to go cast that ballot for 8 years. I strongly recommend this committee oppose House Bill 2555. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Hammond? Representative Miller.
Well, I think he may be on to something, but I don't think he is, because I think what's been described by the Secretary of State is rooted in federal law in terms of that mail needs to be returned for then the act of removing them. No. Well, then he may be on to something, which he's usually ahead of me.
Thank you, Representative Miller. Someone else? If no other questions for Mr. Hammett, thank you, Mr. Hammett, for your testimony. And we will move on to Seal King of the League of Women Voters of Kansas, Advocacy Chair. Seal, are you online?
I'm online. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So a lot of what we had in mind has already been covered. We really appreciate Davis Hammett's close reading of the bills. I know that the community that I live in has a lot of rental units, and I deal with them both as a landlord and as a voter registration advocate. And we see a lot of times that somebody might move every year or every other year from one rental property to another within our community. So we can see that what this might do is to remove that voter because the card might come back undeliverable, but they might have moved just in the next block or maybe 3 blocks away. And if they were still on the voter rolls and they went in to vote, their vote would be provisional because they moved, but their vote would probably be counted for most of the contest or the races on that ballot. So like many of these others, we also oppose this bill. And one point that we would like to bring up is that there is such a thing as ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's a USA nonprofit organization that is operated and financed by state election agencies and chief election officials. States created ERIC to improve the accuracy of state voter registration rolls and boost access to voter registration for all American citizens. It was launched in 2021 by election officials from 7 states. And I think that number has got to be wrong. I think it was probably 2011 or earlier. And now it has enrolled 30 states and the District of Columbia. Kansas, neighboring states of Missouri, Oklahoma, and Colorado are enrolled in ERIC. ERIC uses the most sophisticated matching software available to identify voters who have moved, died, and voters with duplicate registrations within a state's database. States may also request national change of address, excuse me, reports using official data from the U.S. Postal Service, and after federal general elections, participate in a fraud check to see if voters cast ballots in more than one state. And that's all information from Wikipedia about the Electronic Registration Information Center. what the league would like to see Kansas do is also enroll in ERIC and use that to clean up our voter rolls. We agree that having a lot of misinformation on the voter rolls is a problem, but we think this might be a better way to solve that problem. And we ask you to vote no on House Bill 2555. I stand for questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question of Ms. King? Okay. We appreciate your patience in waiting to testify, and I'm sure that will be considered. Thank you. We have one written only, Aileen Berquist, not on the voter roll as a relation of mine, but a community engagement manager for the American Civil Liberties Union of Kansas. So you can find that on your testimony online. Are there any other conferees who wish to speak to this bill? Rick Pifo, are you, excuse me, now for neutral?
Yep, I'm still here.
Thank you.
I just want to clarify a couple things. You have my written testimony. We're generally in favor of this, anything that keeps the voter rolls cleaner. I mean, we do a lot of efforts to make sure, I mean, we're required to read the obituaries, do the felony checks. There's all kinds of things in Elvis that help keep the voter rolls clean. And we already do confirmation mailings. Once a year, we do NCOA across the whole list. So we're doing confirmation mailings, some of these other triggers that are in there. And all this really does is add one more trigger that means that we mail them a card like this. It could be yellow, it could be blue. Some of them use different colors, but they're all generally the same. And so it starts the clock. According to NVRA, you start this, once you've mailed this, it starts the clock to being removed in the future if you then don't vote in 2 federal general elections. And that's explained on the card that if you don't do anything with this, you will be removed after missing a few general elections. But they have, the person that receives this card has basically, there's 3 options when we mail this out. It's either going to come back immediately as undeliverable because we don't know what their new address is. And NCOA is good, but it only goes back so far. So if they moved 15 years ago and they're still registered, they're not going to pick up at NCOA. So it comes back immediately undeliverable and or with either no address or with an address. If it has another address, we're most likely going to mail them another one to the new address, trying to get this card to them so that they can respond. If they get the card, they can either not do anything with it, or they can confirm that they still live at their address that you mailed it to. And if you do that, it takes away the inactive status. They go back to active, they're not in that time clock to be removed. Or they can confirm that they moved to another state. And if they did that, then they could be canceled. And if it just goes in the trash and we don't get it back and whatever, then if they miss the 2 federal general elections, then their status would change to canceled. As far as I know, since we've had Elvis, we've never done a purge. We have a lot of canceled voters in Elvis. So I just disagree with the term purge because we don't really purge them.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Pifo, for always being helpful, which you are. I'm reading from this existing language. It says the confirmation notice shall be sent by forwardable mail. But I thought you just explained that that's not forwardable.
Well, no, it'll follow them wherever they actually are. And then that if they get it, then they can confirm that they now live, I mean, whatever address we mailed it to, if the post office could get it to where they live, then they have the opportunity to return it, and it's postage paid. So they don't have to pay anything.
But you won't, unless they volunteer it, you won't necessarily know the people that have moved if it's forwardable.
Potentially.
And I have to correct the record, I was completely wrong earlier when I explained how I understood it, because I thought they were mailed non-forwardable so as to trigger the notice that they had moved, which seems to me to be a lot better process of identifying ineligible voters.
Sorry, but the idea is that if they get one of these, they should respond to it, and maybe.
Well, but they don't.
Better public.
They don't, or they would have already re-registered. I mean, just the type of individual that didn't bother to re-register when they moved is the same kind of person that's not going to respond to that card. But thank you.
Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm hopeful you can answer this, but if it's not a good question for you, I'm hopeful that Mr. Barker may be able to help out. So as you were talking, I was looking at the printable voter registration card, and it's been a while since I've had to register personally. So I hadn't looked at it in a bit. I notice on there that there is both a mailing address and a residential voting address. So in that case, one of my questions was, if this were to be sent out, would it be sent out to the mailing address on file? Okay. So since it's being sent to the mailing address on file, and would they then, if they were still living at the same residential voting address, but their mailing address had changed, what would happen in that case?
Well, I'm sorry, I nodded my head earlier, but yes, it would be mailed to the mailing address. If their mailing address has changed, then it would go to whatever their new address is, as long as the post office knew where they now live.
So let me give you a little bit of background on this question. In my work as a social worker, we occasionally had clients who would need to have mail sent to our office address. For various reasons. A lot of times it was due to safety, though. And so they wouldn't want anything arriving at their home address. In that case, oftentimes mail would be returned as undeliverable to the sender because of various reasons that have to do with the USPS and how they process mail. So that kind of gives me pause, because my concern would be, even if they were registered at their current residential address and had mail forwarded to a different address, a mailing address on their voter registration record, and it was returned as undeliverable due to no fault of their own, I feel like that would be a really big issue, and we would continue to hurt their ability to vote as they should be able to in elections. So I just wasn't sure if anyone could offer me clarity on how maybe we could address that issue, or if anyone knew.
That is potentially an issue now. We already have all these triggers of NCOA and otherwise to send out a card. So those same people could be already being mailed a card. This is just another reason to mail a card.
Right.
I would note that I had on here, there will be extra cost to the counties because we pay the postage both ways. And the initial slug, once this is passed, we will have an initial slug of cards that have to go out.
Okay. Any other question?
No, I was just hoping that I could get an answer for that, but I know it's a little complicated and unique. It's just something that I experienced on a pretty much daily basis at my former employer, so.
Hopefully it would follow them. I mean, if they're having those kind of difficulties with this card, they should also be having difficulties getting any mail.
They do.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, the only system we really have to rely on is the United States Postal Service.
Thank you, Representative Meyer. Representative Howell, another question?
Thank you. I will be very concise. My question, I think, is probably actually for Deputy Barker, I think. And maybe you know it, but I don't care. Either one of you is fine with me. My question is, if if we pass this law today, let's say, okay, and that person came in to vote and needed to vote provisional, but they had moved within county, would current law allow them, their provisional to still be counted legally?
Yes.
Okay, so I may be incorrect, but I know quite a number of people who move frequently, the kind of, the people that are under the circumstances that cause them to need to move frequently. Most of them move right around the same area. They don't usually move out of county. So that provides me some comfort that legally their provisional ballot would be more likely to be counted.
The only issue with that, I said yes, but I need to clarify that because if they've gone through the entire period and they've been canceled and then they vote provisional, then it would not count. But any activity by the voter after that clock starts, any activity takes them back to active. And then you start all over again. You wait for election cycles, whatever, So like I said, any activity from the voter, so even if they don't return this call, they send something else into the office or whatever, they're activated again. And even if they're inactive, they can go to the polling place and vote. And voting makes them active again.
And I think it's really important that we understand that that doesn't present a problem. It just initiates it again. It's not a plus, it's not a minus.
You guys have probably seen when you get lists from your county, some of them are active, some of them are inactive. The inactives, this is the reason.
Representative Howell, is that clear? Okay. Mr. Pifo, we sure appreciate you testifying and all the other conferees. Is there any other conferees on this bill? All right, we will close the hearing on HB 2555. For your information, HB 2576, 2577, 2579, and HB 2585 will be heard on Tuesday in this meeting at 3:30, and any possible action on the bills that have been heard as far as disposition of the bills. So we are, I believe we're done for today, and appreciate your attendance. And next Monday will be Valentine's Day, for what it's worth. Thank you. We are adjourned.